Have you ever felt alone, distanced from everything and everyone, without understanding why you are going through a period of isolation? Perhaps you wondered if you were being punished or even abandoned. The truth, however, is that this moment of solitude may be divine preparation for something much greater that is yet to come. God, in His infinite wisdom, uses isolation as a powerful tool to shape us, strengthen our faith, and prepare us for great victories. The moments when we feel alone and without answers can be the most crucial in our spiritual journey. Moses spent 40 years in the desert, Elijah found strength in the silence, and Jesus was tested in the wilderness before fulfilling his mission. Isolation, far from being a punishment, is actually a divine opportunity to grow, to find refuge in God, and to be strengthened for what He has prepared for us. If you are going through a period of solitude or facing difficulties, perhaps it is time to stop, reflect, and understand the reason behind this experience. God never abandons us. On the contrary, He uses every moment, every challenge to prepare us for the grand mission He has in mind for us. Do not let the desert in your life discourage you. Instead, see it as a training ground for the victory that is to come. Discover now why God has set you apart and how this moment can be the turning point for great things. Isolation, often seen as a period of loneliness or separation, can actually be divine preparation. God, in His wisdom, uses these moments to shape our hearts and minds. It is in the silence, away from the distractions of everyday life, that we can hear His voice clearly. Sometimes, isolation is necessary for us to reflect on our journey and better understand the plan He has for us. Like Moses, who spent 40 years in the desert before being called to lead the people of Israel, we may be led into a period of preparation that seems long and difficult but ultimately leads to a great purpose. These moments of isolation can indeed be painful and hard to endure. After all, who would choose to face difficulties in solitude? However, it is crucial to remember that God never abandons us. He strengthens and shapes us during these times. When we find ourselves in moments of isolation, we must trust that He is working on our character, preparing us for great victories. Elijah, for example, was taken to the wilderness, where he heard God's voice in the silence. This moment of solitude, far from any distraction, allowed him to receive guidance essential for fulfilling the divine mission in his life. At its core, God uses moments of isolation to help us grow spiritually. The distance from other people and external distractions gives us the opportunity to focus on our relationship with Him. It is not uncommon for something profound to happen within us during these moments of solitude. The faith that was once weak begins to strengthen, and our character is refined. Jesus also went through a period of isolation in the wilderness, where He was tempted. This time of testing was crucial in preparing Him for His ministry. Solitude may seem like a punishment, but in truth, it is God's tool to prepare us for something greater. Isolation, therefore, is a necessary phase for divine preparation. Moses, Elijah, Jesus, all faced periods of solitude to become who God called them to be. When we find ourselves in a situation of isolation, we can be sure that God is guiding us through a path of spiritual maturity and growth. These moments are not just about physical distance. They are about stepping away from external influences to focus on what God has to teach us. We can then view isolation not as punishment but as a time of preparation and transformation. When we are in the midst of a phase of isolation, it is natural to feel confused or even lost. But the truth is that God never leaves His children abandoned. He refines and prepares us for something greater. Like any preparation, the process can be long and difficult, but the reward is certain. God strengthens us in isolation, shaping our character and faith, and guiding us toward a higher purpose. Perhaps you feel alone now, but remember, the isolation you are experiencing may be divine preparation for great victories. God uses isolation to make us spiritually stronger. He gives us the opportunity to reflect on our lives, make adjustments to our character, and learn to trust Him fully. No matter what you are going through now, the important thing is to remember that God is in control of everything. Moments of isolation are often divine preparation for what is to come. And just like Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, you are also being shaped for a purpose greater than you can imagine. It's just a matter of trusting and waiting patiently. The lesson we can learn here is that instead of resisting isolation, we should embrace it as a time for spiritual growth. When we understand that God uses these periods to prepare us for something greater, we see isolation in a new light. It is no longer a prison but a spiritual training ground. In this field, God strengthens and shapes us, helping us grow in faith and character to face the great victories He has for us. The strengthening of character and faith often happens quietly but powerfully during moments of solitude and isolation. It is in this space, distance from distractions, that we can truly focus inwardly, where God begins to work in us profoundly. When we find ourselves in difficult or isolated situations, it is common for our character to be tested. But it is also in these moments that we see our faith being refined and strengthened as we learn to trust God more fully. Just as gold is purified by fire, our character is perfected through the trials of isolation. During isolation, we are challenged to look within ourselves and evaluate what truly matters. We may confront issues like pride, impatience, or lack of faith, but this is when God works most intensely. By stepping away from the influence of others or external distractions, we are forced to face our humanity and seek a deeper connection with the Creator. There is no escaping this process of transformation. It is part of the divine preparation that God has for us. When we open ourselves to this, our faith becomes stronger as we learn to trust Him, even in the most difficult moments. Those moments of solitude can make us question many things. We may wonder if we are being abandoned or if we are alone in this process. However, it is important to remember that God is always with us, even in the quietest moments. He uses isolation to strengthen us so that our faith becomes unshakable, like a rock that withstands the storms. We can think of Jesus in the wilderness, being tempted but remaining steadfast in His trust in God. This is the model for how we can face our own challenges with faith and confidence, even when it feels like we are alone. Over time, isolation teaches us to hear God's voice more clearly. Without the distractions of daily life, we are better able to discern divine guidance and make decisions that reflect our faith and values. During this process, we can experience an inner growth we never imagined possible. Our faith becomes deeper and firmer because we learn to trust God in both the small and big things. When we embrace isolation, we allow ourselves to be shaped by Him to face future challenges with greater confidence and resilience. Isolation also teaches us the importance of patience and perseverance. Often we want to escape solitude quickly, but God shows us that time is necessary for our strengthening. Character is not built overnight. It develops over time, through moments of challenge and reflection. During these periods of isolation, it is crucial to remember that we are being prepared for something great. Just as Moses waited in the wilderness to receive God's mission to free the people of Israel, we must be patient and trust in God's timing for our growth. Faith is a spiritual muscle that needs to be exercised, and isolation provides exactly that. Without the help of others or the distractions of the world, we are forced to put our faith into action and believe in God's promises, even when everything around us seems uncertain. Just like Elijah, who trusted in God's direction even when he was alone, or Jesus, who resisted temptations in the wilderness, we too can learn to trust God during our moments of solitude. These times of trial are opportunities to see our faith being strengthened so that we can face future challenges with courage and confidence. When we look at these moments of isolation, instead of seeing them as a loss or something negative, we should see them as opportunities to strengthen our faith. God does not abandon us in these moments. He is with us, working to transform our lives. Isolation, although often uncomfortable, is a powerful tool for shaping our character and making us people of solid faith. Take advantage of these moments to seek God more deeply, hear His voice, and allow Him to strengthen your trust in Him. The biblical examples of isolation are truly powerful and reveal how God uses silence and solitude to shape His servants and prepare them for great missions. Moses is a classic example of how isolation can be transformative. During 40 years in the wilderness, far from society and everything he knew, Moses was shaped to become the leader of the people of Israel. In that time of separation, God worked on his character, his patience, and his ability to trust Him fully. Moses not only learned to hear God's voice but also prepared himself for the great mission of freeing Israel from Egyptian slavery. Elijah, another great example, also experienced deep isolation. After confronting the prophets of Baal, he found himself fleeing into the wilderness, feeling alone and discouraged. However, this moment of solitude was crucial for his restoration. In the silence of the desert, Elijah had a direct encounter with God, who gave him new strength and direction. God did not speak to Elijah through a great wind or an earthquake but through a gentle whisper, teaching us that in isolation, God often speaks to us in subtle but powerful ways. It was in this wilderness that Elijah was renewed and prepared to continue his mission. Jesus also went through a significant period of isolation. Before beginning his public ministry, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he spent 40 days and nights fasting and praying. During this time of solitude, he was tempted by the devil but resisted all temptations with his full trust in the Father. This period of isolation was essential for Jesus' preparation, not only for his mission but also to teach us how to resist temptation and trust God in all circumstances. The solitude in the desert was a test that strengthened his faith and character, allowing him to start his ministry with unwavering confidence. These biblical examples show us that isolation, far from being a punishment, is often an opportunity for spiritual growth. God uses these moments to prepare us for great victories. Each of these men went through a transformation process that could only happen outside the pressures and distractions of the world. The desert became a training ground where Moses, Elijah, and Jesus were shaped to fulfill great missions. It is in isolation that God often strengthens us to face the battles ahead in our lives. In the case of Moses, he did not know how essential that time of isolation in the wilderness would be for his mission. He probably felt lost and distant from what seemed to be his life's purpose, but God had a plan. Just like Moses, we too may feel lost or abandoned during our moments of solitude, but we must trust that God is preparing us for something great. He uses the desert, the isolation, to shape and strengthen us in ways we could not comprehend in times of comfort. Similarly, Elijah, when feeling alone and discouraged, may have questioned the purpose of his life. However, in the wilderness he was renewed. This teaches us a great lesson. The desert, both physical and emotional, can be the place where God restores our strength and gives us a new vision for the mission he has for us. Like Elijah, we can find comfort in the stillness when God speaks to us and guides us. Even in the silence of solitude, God gives us the instructions we need to move forward. And of course, Jesus' example in the wilderness teaches us a crucial lesson. No matter how challenging the journey is, isolation does not mean abandonment. On the contrary, it is a time of preparation for fulfilling God's will. In the wilderness, Jesus was tempted but also strengthened to fulfill his mission. He resisted temptation with the Word of God, showing us that in moments of isolation, we can use faith in God's Word to strengthen us. Like Jesus, we are called to trust God even in the most difficult situations, knowing that He is preparing us for something extraordinary. These examples of Moses, Elijah, and Jesus show us that moments of isolation are not in vain. Although they may be uncomfortable, they are a fertile ground for spiritual growth and the strengthening of our faith. When we find ourselves in a desert, we can look at these examples and remember that God does not abandon us but is using this time to prepare us for the great victories He has planned for us. Isolation, when lived with faith, becomes a tool for transformation. Moments of isolation are often precursors to great victories. Sometimes, it may seem that we are being distanced from everything that is familiar and comfortable, but the truth is that God is preparing us for something much greater. He uses these periods to strengthen us so that we can be ready for the victories He has in mind for us. Isolation is a silent but powerful preparation that happens when we are away from distractions and the gaze of the world. It is in this space that God can work on our hearts and shape our vision for what is to come. When we go through periods of solitude or difficulty, it is easy to wonder if we are being punished or forgotten. However, it is important to understand that these periods of isolation are often exactly what we need to become stronger and more prepared for the mission God has for us. Just like an athlete who undergoes intense training before a major competition, God prepares us in the training field of isolation so that we can face greater challenges with more confidence. The time we spend in solitude is actually an investment in the future. Isolation gives us the opportunity to grow spiritually and develop essential characteristics for the great victories that lie ahead. When we step away from the distractions of everyday life, we have the chance to focus on our relationship with God, our values, and our faith. It is in this quiet environment that God works on our patience, trust, and perseverance. Moses, for example, spent 40 years in the desert, and during that time, God prepared him for a great mission, to free the people of Israel. Those years of isolation were crucial for the fulfillment of his purpose, and only by looking back could he realize the magnitude of his preparation. Similarly, we can look at our own lives and realize that isolation may be the key to the next great step. Although it may be difficult to see in the moment, each challenge and period of solitude has the potential to prepare us for greater victories. When we are ready, God places us in a position to achieve extraordinary goals. Jesus went through isolation in the desert before beginning his public ministry. This time of preparation was fundamental to the fulfillment of his mission, and by resisting temptation and strengthening his faith, he was ready to transform lives and fulfill God's will. Isolation is not a period of punishment, but a phase of preparation. It allows us to grow in silence, away from the eyes of the world, and gives us the opportunity to focus on what truly matters, strengthening our faith and character. By learning to trust God in moments of solitude, we prepare ourselves for the victories that will come. Each day in the desert, each moment of discomfort, is an opportunity for God to shape our spirit and make us more prepared to face the battles ahead. It is important to remember that victory does not come without preparation. Isolation is part of that process. God is shaping each of us, teaching us to depend on Him and grow in faith. The path to the great victories He has for us is not a straight line, but a process that involves overcoming, learning, and preparation. Just as Moses, Elijah, and Jesus went through periods of solitude before fulfilling their grand missions, we are also called to trust God during our own moments of isolation, knowing that He is preparing us for something much greater than we can imagine. Therefore, as you go through the desert of solitude, remember that it is a time of preparation. Do not give up, do not despair, because victories are approaching. Isolation is not the end but the beginning of a new chapter of achievements. God is working in you, strengthening your faith and character so that when the great victory comes, you will be ready to live out His purpose with confidence and determination. In moments of isolation and difficulty, trusting in God is the refuge that sustains us. When everything around us seems to be falling apart and we find ourselves alone, it is natural for fear and insecurity to try to take over our hearts. However, these are precisely the moments when God calls us to trust in Him fully. His presence never leaves us, even in solitude. He is the safe refuge, the shelter we need when facing the storms of life. God reminds us through His Word that we can rest in His faithfulness, regardless of the circumstances. It is easy to think that we are alone when we go through difficulties. Isolation can make us question whether God is truly with us, whether He has heard our prayers. But the truth is, He is more present than ever. In the silence, He speaks to us, calms us, and gives us the strength we need to continue. Psalm 46 verse 1 reminds us, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. When we face difficult moments, God becomes our safe place, where we find peace and renewal. Trusting God in moments of isolation does not mean that there will be no difficulties. On the contrary, these moments can be challenging, but trusting in His constant presence gives us the strength to overcome any obstacle. We may feel as if we are facing the battle alone, but God is by our side, working within us and preparing us for future victories. When we learn to trust God, our worries begin to fade and our peace grows stronger. This is evidenced in Isaiah 41 verse 10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Isolation, far from being a punishment, can become a time of deep trust in God. He uses these moments to teach us to depend entirely on Him, to rest in His faithfulness. When we face difficulties, it is a reminder that we are not alone. God promises that He will never abandon us, and it is in this certainty that we can find peace. Often, when we distance ourselves from the distractions of the world, we have the opportunity to grow in the trust that God is in control of everything, and this gives us the courage to move forward. In moments of solitude, it is natural to desire quick answers and immediate solutions. but God calls us to trust in Him even without understanding everything. Isolation is an opportunity to surrender our anxieties into God's hands and rest in His peace. The Apostle Paul teaches us in Philippians 4 verses 6-7, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Trusting in God brings us a peace that is not explained by external circumstances, but by His presence in our lives. The refuge we find in God during isolation does not mean there will be no difficult moments. God allows us to go through tests, but He never abandons us. He is our fortress, the safe shelter we need. And as we learn to trust in Him during our most difficult moments, our faith becomes more solid. Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, withdrew to pray, seeking refuge in the Father in the face of the anguish that was to come. He shows us that even in suffering we can find comfort in God. Isolation is not a place of abandonment but of intimacy with the Creator. When we face difficult moments, our tendency is often to want to escape them as quickly as possible. But God uses these situations to teach us to trust Him more. Finding refuge in God helps us grow in faith and become stronger in the face of adversity. We can use these moments of solitude to reflect on our journey with God and allow Him to strengthen us. When we place our trust in Him, we find not only comfort but also the strength to keep going, knowing that He is by our side at all times. Moments of isolation are often more than just periods of separation. They are divine preparation. God, in His infinite wisdom, uses these times of solitude to mold our hearts, refine our character, and strengthen our faith. When we find ourselves alone, without the presence of others or external distractions, we may feel vulnerable, but it is in this space that God works deeply within us. Isolation is not an end in itself, but an opportunity He gives us to grow spiritually, preparing us for something greater that is yet to come. Many times society teaches us to fear isolation, to see it as something negative. But God's perspective on isolation is completely different. In the wilderness, away from distractions and noise, we can hear God's voice more clearly. When we are isolated, we have the chance to reflect on our life, our choices, and our paths. It is in this moment of stillness that God can reveal His purpose for us, adjust our direction, and shape us for the great plans He has for our future. Moses, for example, spent 40 years in the wilderness, a long and difficult time, but it prepared him to be the leader who would free the people of Israel. During isolation, God can teach us lessons that are impossible to learn in the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Elijah went through a time of solitude after a great victory, but it was in this isolation that he found rest, renewal, and a unique encounter with God. Similarly, when we are isolated, we may feel that we are being distanced from everything, but it is precisely in this process that God shapes our hearts and prepares us for the next phase of our lives. Solitude, when surrendered to God, becomes a tool for spiritual growth and preparation for what is to come. Jesus, when led into the wilderness, experienced deep isolation before beginning His public ministry. This time of solitude was not a punishment but divine preparation for the mission He was about to fulfill. The desert was the place where He was spiritually strengthened and where He learned to trust the Father completely. The temptations He faced there, far from weakening Him, prepared Him to be the Savior of the world. Jesus' isolation is a clear example of how God uses such moments to strengthen us and prepare us for great victories. When we are in a period of isolation, it can be difficult to understand what God is doing. We may ask ourselves why we are going through this and what we are supposed to learn. However, it is important to remember that God always has a purpose. He uses isolation as a way to mold us, transform us, and prepare us for a future full of opportunities. Moses did not know, while he was in the wilderness, that he was being prepared to lead a nation. Elijah did not know, while he was in the desert, that he would receive divine direction for his mission. Likewise, we may not know the immediate purpose of our isolation, but we can trust that God is preparing us for something great. In moments of isolation, it is natural to feel lost or even abandoned. But the truth is that God never abandons us. He is by our side, working in us, guiding us, and strengthening us. Like a sculptor shaping a piece of clay, God patiently works on us, molding us according to His purpose. Isolation is an essential part of this process, a time of divine preparation that equips us for the victories to come. When we learn to trust this process, we can see the beauty and wisdom of God, who uses silence and solitude to make us stronger and more prepared to fulfill the mission He has for us. Therefore, when we find ourselves in a period of isolation, we should learn to see it as an opportunity for growth and preparation. Instead of resisting isolation, we should embrace it, knowing that God is using this time to mold and strengthen us.